The next thing I want to do is go into feeding special content. Now, we're kind of ignoring the user interface for right now. Usually we used to go crawl and then serve and show the serve results, and you could build different front ends which are different user interfaces for different user groups. There you could turn on different features. You could specify which URLs are included in those search results. You could specify some additional content to put in. But what we're going to do is we're going to focus in on feeding the special content to round out our crawling portion. The feed is the other it's the mechanism that's used to inject content into the search appliance that's not readily crawlable. Okay? Content that's not readily crawlable. That could be files on a file server. It could be SharePoint content with documents and metadata. It could be Documentum data. A lot of times your enterprise content management systems, your ECMs, they have metadata associated with them, and the crawler just isn't smart enough to know where to go get that metadata, and you have to configure something to tell it how to do that. We have a series of connectors that are built, and they're built on top using feeds. So they'll use a feed to push the content into the GSA. You can build your own feed, or you can rely on one of the connectors that's already built using a feed. So we want to describe what kind of feeds there are and when to use which one. There's two types of feeds. And then we're going to show you how to write one. It's just a simple script or a web service or a script, program, Java, C#, anything. Just all it has to do is send an HTTP post to the GSA on port 19,900 and send an XML document. And that XML document will contain the URL to the document, any metadata associated with it, and possibly the content of the document. You can send crawlable content to the GSA by just sending the URLs. So SharePoint is web crawlable, right? So if you can send all the URLs to all the documents, then the feed can just send the URLs, and the crawler will send GET requests back to the SharePoint server and fetch the content. So here's some examples. Databases are another good one. You can send in the record data from databases along with blobs or clobs or URLs to other documents on a web server, hosted separately on a web server. Applications, if you have portals, email systems, HR systems, billing, whatever application you can think of. It could be even your own custom application. As long as you have an API to fetch the content out of it and the URLs, then you can send that to the GSA. Now, we keep using the term URLs here, but now we're starting to talk about non-crawlable content. So if it's not got a web server and it's not got an HTTP URL, you could send another identifier in as the doc ID, like in a database. You could just send in a concatenation of the record, the unique IDs for that record of data. Search Appliance will take this content and include it in its index. Okay, so it will be indexed. Each record will count as one hit on your license count. Now, the two types of feeds are what we call a metadata and URL feed, which only sends the URL, the unique identifier, and the metadata. So if you have documents on a SharePoint server, and you want to include them, you can use a metadata and URL feed to find the URLs to those specific documents and get the metadata out of the SharePoint API and send that over to the GSA. When you do that, the crawler will pick up and it will send GET requests back to get the URLs. So the GSA is the one who's actually doing the crawling. This is, you can use this for a server that is web enabled. Okay? Now, it could be even your file system. You can send SMB URLs, simple message block URLs. We'll show you how to do that with the file system connector a little bit later. Content feeds push the metadata URLs and the documents, all the content. And this is when you can't send a GET request back to the server. Sending just a URL to the crawler won't work. So you need to be able to include the content. It may be HTML, it may be text, or it may be binary encoded data, such as a Word file or a PowerPoint or a PDF. The GSA doesn't do any crawling in this case. This is what the metadata and URL feed is going to look like. So, out of the box, here's the GSA listening on port 19,900. The rest of the path is /XML feed. If you send an HTTP post there with an XML document, and we'll see what the format looks like in a minute, then this client application that you write will have to go out and find the URLs from your content repository using whatever API gets access into that content system, sends the XML document with the URLs and the metadata, and then the crawler will pick up and send GET requests over to fetch the documents and bring them into the index. The things here to remember, this content repository is going to be receiving HTTP GET requests from the GSA, so it has to be web enabled. If you're using a content feed, in addition to the URLs and the metadata, you'll also fetch the documents, base64 encode them if they're binary, and then send them along inside that XML document. So that XML document is going to get quite big. It's going to have, maybe a megabyte for each of these documents. You can send up to a gigabyte feed file. I'll try and point to the opening and closing tags. So here's the GSA feed. This is the XML document you're going to send. Inside of here is a header with a data source and a feed type. This is just simply the name that's going to be recorded in the GSA of this feed, and whether it's incremental or full, or metadata and URL. If it's metadata and URL, it's just going to send metadata with the URLs, and that's it. If it's incremental or full, it's a content feed, and it's going to send a group. And at the group level, you can specify some of these attributes, like action is add, MIME type is whatever the MIME type of this document. So it's a way of shrinking the size of your file. But the important stuff is what goes on at the record level. Each record is a specific document. You send, let's see, in this case, you'll specify whatever URL is pointing to this document. The action is going to be either add or delete, meaning add it to the index or remove it. And it's MIME type. MIME type is important so that the search appliance knows how to convert that document. In this case, we're sending an HTML document. And this should have been HTML content. We'll see an example of HTML in a minute. Here's the metadata block and its name and value. So this document has province of Quebec and city of Montreal. And here's the content. Inside this content tag, here's where you specify the either text, HTML, or binary. Here's what the HTML escaped would look like. So good question. Put it in a CData block so that it escapes it properly and doesn't interfere with the XML. If it's a metadata and URL feed, it's going to send a GET request. If it's a content feed, you can lie. Because the content feed, all it's doing is using that URL as an identifier, a unique identifier. And here's what binary encoded, base64 encoded binary data would look like. So if you're going to include a Word document or PDF, it's going to have all kinds of character strings in it. So you want to run it through a base64 encoding. You can just get an encoder from the web, just download it, it's free. And it'll create these character sequences so they don't interfere with the XML tags. And that's a content feed. See, there we're also providing the content. To set the GSA up and configure it to receive the feed, all you have to do is specify the URL pattern that you're going to be sending it. You don't have to give a start pattern because the feed is going to be supplying those start URLs this time. Okay. There's, at the bottom of this, on the feeds link here, there's a page that opens up and you can specify whether you're going to accept feeds from all IP addresses or just a specific host. Okay? It's probably a good idea to specify a specific host because that will ensure that only your application is sending content to the index. So feed type configuration can affect a couple of things. One is the crawler access. We haven't talked about secure content just yet. Crawler access is a way of providing a user ID and a password to the GSA so it can fetch the documents from the server if they're secure. That would only be used if you're using a metadata and URL feed. If you're using a content feed, you're already just passing all the content, so the GSA doesn't have to do any crawling and doesn't have to provide any credentials. Return URLs, like you were asking, can you just lie to it? If you're sending a content feed, yeah, you can just lie to it. Now the question is, if the user clicks on that link, what's it going to go to? And it might be it might be a web service call, and you might pass the unique identifier of the document. So it's up to you as to whether, or it could be something that's just totally bogus. And it might just sit there and click, 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 nothing happening. That might be an option. And then how are authentication and authorization handled? We'll look at that a little bit more when we look into security. But users will be, if you're setting up secure results, they'll have to be authenticated with the search appliance, meaning you have to send off some they'll have to enter in a user ID and a password, or provide a ticket or a token. And then the search appliance will have to go out and establish or validate whether they are who they say they are, and then we'll have to go through the authorization process. And if it's, so if you're using a metadata and URL feed, for example, those links will be followed. If you're using a content feed, it won't follow the links. That's right. So what you'll have to do is write the crawler. If you're using a content feed, you have to get a little bit smarter sometimes. You have to write the crawler logic to go out and fetch and find all those URLs. The nice thing about the metadata and URL feed is that it gives you better it can give you better relevance, because it can still maintain all that link structure. The content feed may not be able to maintain a link structure because it's not really going out and crawling the content. So here's what this is just an HTML form that we're going to use like in our lab scenario. And it's going to perform one action. It's going to make an HTTP post to your GSA. And you're going to specify in this form whether it's a metadata and URL feed or a content feed by choosing full or incremental, and then choosing the location of the XML document that we're going to post to the GSA. Now, there's some additional input parameters that go along with this post, and you'll have to also specify them. It's you're going to specify the type of feed. That also has to be sent as an HTTP parameter, as well as the name of the feed. Okay, so even though the XML document has the data source and the feed type, you still have to specify them in an HTTP header. When you send feeds to the search appliance, you'll get reporting on what's coming in, the content. You'll see different values for whether it was a secure connection using HTTPS or HTTP. And if you want to be secure, when you post your feed, you can use port 19,902 and use an HTTPS connection and set up SSL certificates on the search appliance. If the feeds were rejected, if there was an unauthorized connection, if there's a standard connection, so you get some metrics here on what's coming in from the feeds. Also, under the feeds page, which we have yet to see, you'll see the status, whether it's failed an error, whether the completed with an error, or if it's completed without any errors. And these are the names of the feeds that were being sent. So here's one of them called meta feed JR. Here's its type. There's the date. Failed an error. Documents that were included, looks like it got 0 that succeeded. Documents with errors, 3. And then the size. And you can click on the download link to find out what that XML document looked like. So you can see which URLs are being sent. Here's the most common error you're going to get, not matching the URL patterns. What do you think that indicates? Bad URL. So you sent a URL with a feed, and it didn't match any of the follow and crawl patterns. So go back. Here, if we didn't have a follow and crawl pattern that matched one of your URLs, then you're going to get an error. Because the GSA is going to say, I got a URL, and then I tried to follow it, but I didn't have a matching follow pattern. All right, some other things to know. Some additional attributes that can come along with the record tag. MIME type, which is useful for proper file conversion. Last modified date. So at the record level, when you send in a document with a URL, you can specify its last modified date. You can specify an authentication mechanism, whether it's HTTP basic, NTLM, or HTTP SSO. What you're doing is you're telling the search appliance that this is a secure URL, meaning that there has to be user has to be authenticated and authorized to be able to see that document in order to get access to it. You can specify the display URL. So if you want to have a content feed that lies and says, the document is really just a database record, and give the record ID, but then on the display URL, you might send a URL link to a web service that's JDBC enabled to go back to the database and fetch the content. Also, you can send in the the ACLs, which are access control lists for the users and the groups that have access to the content. So that's used for your authorization. Here's an example of the display URL. So here's our record tag with the URL. but the display URL points to something different. So if you have chapters of a book, maybe your book is really big. Maybe it's bigger than, maybe your document is bigger than a gigabyte. You can specify links to the individual chapters, but then the display URL is to the entire book. So if the user clicks on a search result, they go back to the entire, the beginning of the book. Here's how you turn on HTTPS for secure HTTP posts. It's just a checkbox. And then you have to upload a self-signed certificate or authority signed certificate. Other things to know, the individual documents, the maximum file size can be configurable. The feed file size is limited to 1 gigabyte. So if you have more than a gigabyte of content to push to the search appliance, you can break it up into several feeds and push it using the same feed name. If you push too many feeds, you may experience some timeouts. You can get the backlog count by going to this URL. And you could consider using a connector because it will start to throttle. To delete a feed, you can either use a do not crawl pattern. Okay, just add in a do not crawl pattern into the GSA and it will remove those URLs from the index just like before. You can delete the feed from the feeds page for content feeds only. Or you can delete individual records by using action equals delete. Here's my XML document. No, is my form? This is my form. So I'm going to do a post to GSA 14, port 19,900, and that's all I need to do for this form. It's just identify the GSA. So I'll use that to post my XML document in a minute. Here's my metadata feed that I'm going to send. Okay. And what have I got in this case? I'm going to call it meta feed. So this could be sales, this could be engineering, could be anything. It's a metadata and URL type feed. Here's my documents. Now I'm going to be sending metadata and URL feeds. So I know that the content has to be crawlable, and why am I doing this? Why would I send URLs to the GSA with a feed? What's the advantage here that I get with a feed? Yeah, metadata. So I'm going to be identifying different types of animals. I'm going to specify their class and their order. Notice in this case the class is Mammalia for both. One of them's a rodent, one's a carnivore. They are located here on the feeds page, feeds folder. And there's actually going to be, the striped skunk and the prairie dog I'm going to send in. There's actually some other documents that are already there. What do I have to do to prepare the GSA to receive the feed? Make sure I have a follow and crawl pattern set up for those URLs that I'm going to send in. The robots.txt file will honor the feed. The feed will honor the robots.txt file. Here's my feeds page. And here's my reporting and status. I don't have any feeds that have been currently pushed, and I'll trust feeds from all IP addresses, because I don't know what my laptop IP address is in this case. I'll go back over to the form and I'll post. I'll call this meta feed. It's a metadata and URL feed type. So these are the HTTP headers that I have to send. And here's my document. Submit, sends an HTTP post. My XML document went to the GSA. I got success, which just tells me if I got an HTTP connection to it. It doesn't tell me anything about the feed itself. So I'll go to the feeds page to see if I got valid response. Okay, I was able to successfully feed 2 documents using, this is the name of the feed. So if you're going to make incremental, so you have a couple choices. You can set a metadata and URL feed, which will add to whatever's already in this feed. So if new documents get added, you can repost and send more content to it. If it's a content feed, you have to choose whether it's a full feed or an incremental feed. A full feed will overwrite what was there before in the index. I completed. I had 2 documents, no errors, and I can even download and look at the XML file it was sent. good for troubleshooting. Let's take a look. Here's my XML document. Looks the same as what I just saw on my files on my laptop just a minute ago. Okay, so no mystery there. That's where you can check for errors. If you think you thought you said the right data but you didn't, you can check. Now go over to crawl diagnostics. And I'll look for my fed content. Hasn't shown up yet. The crawling, the feed has also got a delay on it, just like the crawler. So the best thing to do is just be patient. It will show up. Let's go ahead and take a look at what the documents look like on the website. So Athens, feeds, files. There are 4 files in this directory. If I had links to, from the prairie dog or the striped skunk to the other documents, they would have also been, the crawler would have fetched would have received the prairie dog file, opened it up, found some links, and then gone and fetched the other content. Yeah. Now let's take a look at the prairie dog document. Let's also try to view source. So if I had additional metadata, it would be added here. I don't have any metadata in the document. I sent it through my feed. Okay. All right, now let's go back to crawl diagnostics, see if I can see the search results. Let's do an update. Here's my feeds documents. Drill down. Let's see if I've got a cached version. That's one way of checking to see if it's in the index. Not quite in the index yet. And I don't see a page rank. It might have a small page rank and be very difficult to see. I'll try and run it, search, and see if I can get it anyway. In URL, feeds. Okay, here we go. Yeah, I've got some. And what I don't see, let's see, wait a minute. This looks like just the, I don't see the snippet. Oh, because I did an in URL search. I don't see the snippets then. Let's see what kind of, I can look for today or black-tailed prairie dog. The only other thing I really want to show you is metadata. How do you see the metadata? And there's 2 things we have to set up to make that happen. One, we have to make sure that we request the metadata back from the GSA. And the other is we have to set up a flag on the front end to display the metadata results. We'll look at those when we get into front ends and XSLT style sheets.